Hi, welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and today I am really excited to be joined by Professor Damien Page. Hi, Damien, how are you?
Yeah, morning. Really well. Thanks for inviting me on, Jane.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you, Damien, about education and advantage and privilege and how we can be more inclusive. But to begin with, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, please, and your background?
Yes, yeah, certainly. So I'm first generation into university. I grew up in Kent in the Medway Towns, which when I grew up back in the 70s, I mean, I'm 50 now, so I grew up there back in the 70s. It was a very traditional working class white area.
Hmm.
The main employer in the Medway Towns was the Chatham Dockyard.
Okay.
And so, the employment was good. Most people were connected to it in one way or the other. Then the 80s hit, Margaret Thatcher and her wisdom closed down the dockyard, and it decimated the whole area. And so I remember even as a child growing up and, where people had pretty secure employment, the people were out working, men and women, there's a lot of women employed in the dockyard as well. And it just changed, so rapidly. I remember going into school, primary school at the time, and hearing about the impact of this unemployment. And my dad was made unemployed as well. And I think it was the first time that I really thought about poverty or
Okay.
experienced it. We'd always thought that, we were secure, there was enough food on the table. We didn't go on fancy holidays or anything,
Hmm.
but we weren't in a vulnerable position until that point. And I remember my dad, and I didn't fully understand it. I was a kid. But when he came home and he was going to be made redundant, there was a kind of fear, and it just spread throughout the area.
Sure.
And so as it got worse, I mean, Dad found another job, but wasn't the job he trained for. And the area just started changing. My friends would start talking about substance misuse started rising, alcoholism
Okay.
rose, domestic violence increased, and the kind of conversations that were happening become far more pronounced. So that's the kind of background. Um, I I went to grammar school, but they had the 11 plus system down. And I got a grammar school, and it was, well, you're destined for university. So what the hell is university? I knew I'd heard of them, obviously, but I had no understanding. And I
Right.
went through most of secondary school, not really understanding, because no one else in my family had stayed on education past 16.
Sure.
So as much as they tried to prepare us, when I did get to university, and then to be fair, I mean, it's a terrible thing to admit, but I only really went because I didn't know what else to do. You
Right.
know, I,
Okay.
I wasn't good at many things, but I was good at English literature was the subject I took. And
Fab.
I enjoyed reading, but it wasn't something that was done in my area or my family.
Right. Yeah.
Sitting there reading Dostoevsky or whatever it is was a strange thing, and my cousins would have mocked me mercilessly.
Sure. Yeah.
So it was there was, I think that's where I've talked about it a lot about being liminal.
Hmm.
You're not quite in one world and you're not quite in the one you came for either. So university was an odd experience. I didn't make the most of it. I was what was now known as a commuter student, lived at home
Okay.
still. I had to work part-time to support myself, even though there was no fees back then.
Mm.
I still had to support myself. So I was, loading lorries in the evening and holidays, that sort of thing. So it wasn't a great experience, but I enjoyed the learning. And
Okay.
I think what I did get from it, I started to sense the transformational impact of education, particularly higher education.
Hmm.
I came out, I didn't have a clue what to do. I mean, English lit degree, what are you going to do? You're going to teaching, that was the main thing. Didn't want to do that at the time. So I went into advertising,
Okay.
worked there in sales, worked there. And it was just, it wasn't something I enjoyed. It paid the bills, but after a few years, it was just I've got to do something that's actually meaningful. I recognised that. I mean, you mentioned privilege. What I had was a privilege. Particularly from someone coming from my era, my family. I had an opportunity, and I thought, "What do I want to spend it doing this for the rest of my life?" And just didn't. So I got a good bonus one year, and as soon as the bonus cleared, I had handed my notice in, flew away to Southeast Asia for 6 months, and just
Found
do what you.
yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was. It's a terrible
Looked for
cliche.
yourself anyway, or looked, yeah, had a bit of fun, hopefully.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. We had a lot of fun over there, but there was a point that comes, and I thought, look, I don't know how it happened, and I'll probably romanticize it a bit, but it was the very early hours of morning after full moon party, which is quite notorious at it. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, just sitting on the beach, and I just thought, going into teaching.
Mm.
You know, it was as simple as that. So when I ran out of money, came home, saw an advert in the local paper, and I kind of thought about it. I didn't want to do primary. You
Okay.
know, it's just not my thing. That's a
Fair enough.
hard.
Yeah, yeah, it's
That's
very
a
hard.
hard job. Secondary, similarly. So, and I saw an advert for teacher training for post 16, and it said about teaching FE colleges, teaching prisons, and I thought, yeah, this sounds good. This is something that attracts me. And I never looked back. It was so I did the teacher training, worked in Lewisham College for 6 years, teaching English communications, that sort of thing. And it was just one of the most profound experiences of my life. I loved it. I've been probably close to workaholism, being a workaholic a few times. So 20 years in education, but there was probably the first time. And I didn't think anything of it. It was just, I was up at 5:30 in the morning preparing lessons. There was just a passion and the motivation, and I just never stopped. Even in the summer holidays, I'd be reading and constantly preparing. It was also the first time, growing up in a really, and it sounds strange, but growing up in a working class, very white area, working in Lewisham College was a bit of a culture shock.
Was it quite diverse?
Yeah. I mean, it's in the city. Most of my students were black.
Okay.
And had been failed by the secondary education system.
Right.
Very different experience to the one I'd had. And it was an education in that regard as well, a wonderful education. Because when you're getting students turning up late because they've been stopped by the police again for the fourth time that week, coming in hungry, coming in no access to shower or clean clothes. It was a tough place to work, but just so rewarding. And it transformed the way that I understood and appreciated education. So after that, I did that for about 6 years. Then went to worked at Birkbeck for a little bit. Then went into teacher training, University of Greenwich. So I was training post 16 teachers, and again it was phenomenal. Started my PhD the same week I started the job, and really got engaged in research for many years. Bounced around a while, so went up to Leeds Beckett as Dean of the School of Education there for a few years. Pandemic hit, and that was its own kind of learning. Then I was exec dean at University of Wolverhampton for a massive faculty, about 12,000 students. Wow. Now deputy Vice-Chancellor at Buckinghamshire New University. Yeah. So potted history.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. I mean, I knew bits of it from kind of your posts on Twitter, which is where I found you. Like many people who I've interviewed, I must say, I know it has its dark side. But I find it a great way of just connecting and learning from people. So that's certainly a very interesting journey into university leadership. And you kind of touched on it a bit there, that education in general is widely recognized as a kind of great equalizer in society, and that higher education in particular, if you can get there, it can transform lives. Giving people from backgrounds like your own or kids from Lewisham opportunities for meaningful, well-paid work and expanding social networks, which we all know is so important for hearing about jobs as well. And so from your own experience, as a young person moving through the system, like when you were in university and now you're at the top of university, do you think universities do enough to reduce the barriers for people from more marginalized and stressed communities to access them? And if they don't, what needs to happen, do you think?
I think some do.
Okay.
I think most universities will pay attention to it. Some, I think, is still lip service, frankly. When you look at the statistics of students from less advantaged backgrounds, for example, they're pretty low in some universities. I've only ever worked in what used to be called post-92 universities. I've only ever wanted to work in widening participation university. So I'll probably have a different perspective. I mean, we talk about a university sector. I'm not even sure it is one sector, to be fair. The agendas are very different. The emphases are very different. And I think the political power of different universities is a separating factor. But some do. It usually focuses on finance.
Okay.
Finance hardship support, and that's getting more difficult. At a time when universities are in financial difficulty, 40%, 50% are going to be in deficit. So that's getting more difficult. I think it's too narrow sometimes. It focuses on, it has to focus on hardship, and the practicalities. But the wider parts of it, something like timetabling. Timetabling traditionally, you put all the data in, it spits out, and students could be coming in 4 or 5 days a week. Sometimes just an hour a day in the sector in general.
Sure.
So we need to think about, well, I mean, some of our students here, they have to make a decision whether they're going to get the bus or the train to come here to study, or they're going to eat. That's how bad the cost of living crisis is for students, particularly from underrepresented groups. So it has to be very broad. What I find really interesting about your question is around, was it used the term stressed communities? Yeah. That's not fully developed. The understanding of, I talk about this a lot, poverty has a long tail, and it's not just a financial tail, the amount of, I don't think there's a very good understanding of trauma in the sector. Schools are getting much better at it. They do have that understanding because they've got that great level of engagement with families. So they see the reality of it. I mean, I've worked with some academics who are just so completely removed from the fact that, the young people particularly, actually all ages are coming in. We've got a lot of students who are mature here. And they have care responsibilities. There was a HEPI report out a little while ago about how many students are having to work. And this is not the old days when I had to work part-time. Some of them are trying to do full-time work at the same time as full-time study. So I don't think we understand that as a sector well enough, or the impact of that, what it means, and it's not just students going to be more tired, for example. There's a fatigue that is greater than just physical tiredness. We need a proper understanding of trauma and the difficulties. And we talk about students having complex lives. I'm not sure the sector really understands just how complex or what the implications of that is. So I think it needs to be wider. So it was an interesting way you pointed out about around stressed communities, because we need to address that as well as the financial barriers.
Thanks, Damien. And from because the topic of this podcast is relationships matter, from the relational side of it, if you're from an underrepresented community with a lot of stress in your life, who's worked really hard to get to this point now, to get this opportunity. But as you say, there may be many different types of stressors, relational ones, childcare ones, or issues around your own identity and your body in the world. If you're LGBT or you're Black or whatever, relationally, like, do universities get that it's not that easy in that sense either, to feel safe and make friends? And that's important too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think this is where a university's health in many ways comes down to its relationship with the student union. So here, our students' union, and I always plug this one, it was voted #1 student union in the country, and for a good reason. Because they take an approach. We have a program called the Big Deal, where students can, so as well as providing hardship and that kind of the hardcore financial support, our students also get free access to cultural events. So, we'll have students coming here who've never been to the theatre. And we take it for granted because with universities as a sector, we're so focused on, the material support. We forget about the barriers to culture, or sporting activities, for example. So we pay through the Students' Union for that. All of our students get to do these cultural experiences for free, because we know it has to be about more than that. We understand. I remember the first time going to the theatre, I was just so overwhelmed, and not in a good way. Just go out of place. Go and see Shakespeare for the first time.
It's so weird.
It's an unusual world, So again, if we're going to properly prepare students, of course we focus on the subject, of course we focus on the degree, but it has to be more than that. We're preparing students for a world they're going out into that is discriminatory. And it comes back, and another hobby horse of mine, the way universities are held to account for graduate outcomes.
Right.
Which is fine. We're supposed to be preparing students for the graduate employment. Of course we are. That's what we're here for. What the debate never really acknowledges is the barriers, the discriminatory barriers in the graduate jobs market.
Sure.
If you're a mature student, you're less likely to get a graduate job. If you're black or mixed race, you're less likely to get a graduate job. If you're disabled, if you're a woman, you're going to get a lower salary. If you're from an area of disadvantage, then you're far less likely to get a graduate job. So that's a societal issue. That's an employment sector. Yet universities are held responsible for it.
Sure.
So universities like us, if we're going to do widening participation well, which we do, I'm proud to say, we have to think about that. We have to get our students to be more enabled to get a graduate job, because they're going to face significant barriers once they leave us. So yeah, I've probably gone off the topic a bit, but yeah, it's that breadth of how we support students that's important.
Thanks, Damien. So I mentioned social media and finding you on Twitter. Some of the people that I follow there as well are from minoritized groups, either say in the States or in the UK, maybe working in higher education, and some have left. Left faculties because they felt unsupported and not safe. And some who are still there have been critical of diversity, equality, and inclusion efforts, saying it's kind of window dressing. It doesn't really get to the root of issues that, to be fair, are long-standing and kind of wicked problems, to use one of the phrases my boss likes. And so they feel that kind of universities are doing too little to get to the root of the problem. What's your own view on this matter? Like, is there value in them, or are they limited?
Do you know, I thought about this morning, and it's a weird analogy, but EDI is a bit like the BBC. It's attacked from both sides. One side will say it's too left wing, the other side says it's too right wing. EDI is a bit like that. And I have a lot of sympathy for this argument. Universities should be doing more. As a sector, we should be doing systemically doing more. So I understand that. And man, I've worked in a lot of different universities, and yeah, a lot of it is window dressing. But it's also I've worked with places and colleagues that are doing it well.
Okay.
Because there's also the debates on the other side, and I get contacted on social media by a number of people who said, "Oh no, EDI is doing too much. It's about meritocracy."
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, that's another soapbox. And the belief that universities are meritocracies, or education is a meritocracy, and it's about selecting the right person for the job. Just so happens that the right person always seems to be often male, white, and able-bodied.
A bit of a coincidence, all right.
Exactly. So EDI for me, it has to be about pragmatism. The debates are important, but the debates aren't going to make the change.
No.
So while we need to have those debates, EDI has to be above all. It has to be pragmatic, because the debates are about systemic issues. Well, how do you, that requires more buy-in. So it's a longer term movement, but in the interim, EDI is the best we've got.
I get you. We need to start somewhere and make it meaningful.
Absolutely. So take something like recruitment and the underrepresentation, particularly at senior levels in universities, of global majority and disabled colleagues. So we know it's an issue, and universities will wring their hands and shake their head and say, "Oh, we're going to do this." And too often, the go-to solution is unconscious bias.
Right.
I co-wrote a paper with Shirley Ann Tate, who's a professor. I work for Leeds Beckett, phenomenal academic, who's now over in Canada. And I learned a lot from that. I can talk, because she brings that wider debate of greater understanding than I will ever have around how racism plays out within organisations. But unconscious, it's just not the way. What's it going to do? I mean, if unconscious bias worked, most universities have been doing it for years now. Well, we haven't seen significant change.
Yeah.
You do a 15-minute online e-learning module, and suddenly you're supposed to be kind of get a Damascene conversion around. All this time I've been biased. I didn't realise. I just don't buy it. It has a place, if it's done properly and if it's done well, but it's not the solution. The biggest universities have to be willing to take the big actions. here at B&U, so last year we introduced an inclusive recruitment policy. Now, all universities will claim they recruit inclusively, yet you never seem to see that shift. We actually have, with this over the last year since we introduced it. We've seen a massive increase in the amount of disabled colleagues we've employed at senior levels, particularly global majority colleagues at senior levels. So the kind of approach we've taken, and it comes back to that being pragmatic. So we send out interview questions 72 hours in advance for all roles.
Amazing.
From the most junior right to the most senior. Because particularly around neurodiversity as well.
Yeah, that preparation, I get that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And, we've been criticised for it. People saying, oh, well, they're going to be cheating. People will come pre-prepared. It's not true. With the quality of interviews and selection has gone up, has gone through the roof. People become very thoughtful. They're talking about their real life experiences. They're picking the best experiences that they can to talk about.
Yeah.
So you have to ask the right questions. We don't want, AI generated, what makes you a good leader kind of thing.
Yeah.
We don't do that. So we craft the questions really well, but the responses have been phenomenal. And with the quality of the people that recruit, and I only really see the senior level, it's just phenomenal. And we've seen that massive increase in the amount, like I say, we're recruiting more disabled people at senior levels, more global majority colleagues. We offer alternative methods to interview. So if neurodivergent applicants, for example, want to do a video presentation, we can do that. We insist on mandatory diverse panels.
Super.
And again, here's another example. And I won't name the university. Another university I worked in, I'd been there a little while, and I said, well, you say in your policy you talk about diverse interview panels. How many of them actually are diverse? How many include global majority colleagues, for example? Right. And it was about 12%. So there was a policy in place. Everyone knew about the policy. 12% actually were. And I said, okay, from now on, no interview panel is going to proceed unless I sign it off and you can satisfy me it is diverse. Went up to 95% within 2 months.
Wow.
So you have to, that's what I'm talking about, pragmatism. I could have debated for years, about the merits of mandatory diverse panels. And again, some people really did not like that action, but it worked. And we saw the throughput of that, because then, we did recruit a far more diverse group of applicants. So that's what I mean by pragmatism. Above all, debates, absolutely. And we need to look at systemic issues. I'm not disputing that. But in the meantime, let's just get on the pragmatics.
Yes. And start making some inroads there. I really like that idea actually of the interview questions for everyone, because there have been many interviews I've done where I've not thought of better, the best examples I could possibly give, and you'd be kicking yourself afterwards for not having sold yourself to the best of your ability. With such privileges that I have, so I think that does equip people to represent themselves in the best possible way, or at least takes away some of the barriers to that. So it seems like a very interesting approach. Damien, how and why did you become interested in university leadership yourself?
There's a couple of reasons. I think for the same reason I went into teaching, is that you just want to make a difference. You want to do something that's meaningful. So it's partly altruistic, partly deeply selfish in a way. To do something, not in a bad way, but I think we spend so long at work, and particularly in education, it takes so much from us. When you think about the careers, we all have those days where you think, oh, how am I going to get out of bed? You've just done a 12-hour day or whatever it is, and you think, how am I going to do it today? But it's that meaning that gets us out of it. There is nothing as pleasurable or as joyful as doing meaningful work.
That's right.
And I've done deeply unmeaningful work, so I know. I've been there. I've done crappy jobs. So there is a level of meaning to it. So it's personal as well. But that making the change. So it's the same reason leadership, but it's just at a bigger scale. I worked with, I've had some terrible bosses over the years. I've had some really good bosses, but some terrible bosses. And I've seen some terrible leadership. And I thought, God, I can do better than that. You're in this privileged position, and you're benefiting themselves.
Yeah.
you're not making the change or the big, that you really could. And not just to the organisation, but, to communities,
Yes,
to individual lives. What we do, we're not just talking about individual transformation, we're talking about generational change. Once a student, a first generation student comes to university, if we do what we do well and prepare them for graduate employment, they go out and get that job. That's generational change.
it is.
They're changing the whole trajectory of their children, their grandchildren. We talk about generational poverty. Education in many ways is the antidote to that.
Yeah.
So that's what inspires me. The difficult thing, I think, the more senior you get, the more you work by proxies.
Right.
So, you think about metrics. Metrics is a big part of our world. And so, I see pass rates, percentage completion, retention, all of those kind of things are percentages. The problem is you get so carried away with that, and I have done over the years, you forget these aren't percentages, these are
people.
These are students. These are people. That 1% represents hundreds of students who are going to experience generational change because of what we do. So what you have to do at my level is get back down on the ground. You have to hear directly from students. I do this thing. So we do reverse mentoring here, and I've done that in a number of organisations, which is great. And we pay them
sorry,
well.
actually, what is it? Just in case I didn't understand it correctly.
Sure.
Yeah.
The way I've experienced it here and other universities, where students kind of mentor upwards.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah.
we have a student mentor, and we do pay them. I mean, this is a thing. I know the other universities do it and they don't, but again, we know the reality of our students' lives, and it's a way of understanding their experience. So I will shadow students, for example, for an entire day, so that I can understand from the moment they get onto our campus. I follow them. Sounds not in a creepy way. I mean,
no, I get you. I get you. Yeah.
So you follow them out. So I see what the experiences of like coming onto campus, moving through reception, what the canteen is like from their point of view. How they can talk me through the kind of financial choices they're having to make. I get to a greater understanding of what their lived experience is than I will do through proxies. You have to keep coming back to that. These are people. I think you summed it up perfectly there.
Damien, it sounds like a very interesting way, certainly, of feeling what it's like a little bit, or getting more of a glimpse, and bringing to life, I guess, some of the people behind the statistics, particularly if they're from more stressed communities, perhaps in some way, and how is it like to navigate the campus? Would you agree that leadership is a very relational endeavour?
Yeah, it's deeply relational. It's probably not, when it's done properly, it shouldn't be anything other than relational. Leadership gets carried away. You do any leadership training, and a lot of it's not very good, to be honest.
Yeah.
I read a lot about leadership, and a lot of that's bad as well, because they'll talk about take something like vision. Right? Now, vision's really important for leadership, and I'm not disputing that, but they suck all the relational parts out of that. The expression of a vision is about relationships.
Yeah.
But too often it's positioned as something external from people. It's about how people relate to, like a shared journey, almost.
Yes.
A shared vision. How does it relate to colleagues internally? How does it relate to students? How does it relate to communities or sectors that we work in? So I think sometimes leadership theory in particular will strip out all the relational elements. That gets passed on to a separate paradigm of management. And management is relational, and you can't really separate them. You have to do both. But it's about relating to people properly. Yes. That's the trick. The best leaders I've worked with, and I've worked with some great ones, they understood that. They understood that every interaction, every email they send, even, is not just an email or an interaction. It's about relations. And you're either strengthening relationships or you're damaging relationships. Sometimes somewhere in between. But that's what leadership is. You have to understand that. So you have to be authentic. I mean, but authenticity gets easier the more senior you get.
Is that right?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm in a privileged position where I can be authentic. I can be myself because you know, I think people in academia, particularly, you're so self-conscious all the time.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're global majority, particularly if you're a woman or LGBTQ or disabled, you kind of, there's still the outsiderness,
Yes.
so you have to change the ways that you are perceived because you receive additional scrutiny.
Hmm.
You just do. I've seen women, particularly global majority women in leadership positions, and they get far more scrutiny than a white man ever.
Yeah.
They just do. So authenticity is also easier if you're a straight white male. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it
Which
just
again
is.
is a form of privilege. You can't do
Yeah,
anything about it, but that, as you say, that is the has been the dominant um position for a really, really long time. So to
yeah,
shift that um is challenging. I like your point about the vision too, because one of the things we're interested in my team at the University of Limerick is implementation science as well. And of course, like a heroic leader with the vision will get nowhere if the underlings don't share it too, and if they don't listen to them and bring them on board and generate that buy-in. So that part is deeply relational too, the kind of actually bringing the vision into action and um, narrowing the gap. Um, so are there particular attributes in university leadership that you think are of, more importance than others, Damien?
yeah. I mean, you have to listen properly.
Hmm.
You know, lots of leaders will listen and not hear. Lots of leaders will listen and not act upon what they hear. They filter out so there's a bias in how things are interpreted, in whose voice is listened to,
Hmm.
whose perspective is listened to, whose isn't. So yeah, listening is there. Being able to understand different perspectives. Um, for me, probably the most important is around developing people. It's and we talk about the meaning of the job and of being a leadership. It's my favourite part is developing people, seeing people's careers develop. Giving them the space and the autonomy and the support wherever it's needed. Space is an underrated. It's not particularly an attribute, but the ability to give people spaces, to develop themselves, to learn, to fail, and an acceptance and acknowledgement that failure is okay.
Yeah.
We don't hear that often enough. Usually it's, oh, God, something failed. So what? Things fail.
Hmm.
We're in complex organisations. Not everything's going to work. But did we learn from it? Are
Yes.
we giving people space to fail?
Mm.
Try stuff out. Nothing fails, and you're just playing too safe.
That's
So we
right.
have to create that kind of culture where it's okay to experiment.
Mm.
What we do in organisations is a sandpit. It should be. You try things out. We did obviously all universities are thinking about AI and how we use it. We did. We just said we'll play with it. Here's three different AI. So we said we've got licenses and everything for three different types of AI. Gave it to a sample of colleagues across the university and said, play with it, see
Mm.
what it does. See if it can help you in your work. See if it can help our students to progress. See if it can help your research. Some did, some didn't. But the learning that we got from that was what was important.
Mm.
It's not that time, if something failed, it's not that you wasted time, you're learning. So it's creating and I think protecting that culture
Yeah.
because people get too worried about failure, I think.
Yes.
And so the failure becomes the focus rather than what you learn from it. So those are the kind of things. And it comes back to the other thing. You have to be aware that, particularly at senior levels, you are subject to a lot of gatekeeping. Something goes wrong, there are so many levels before it gets to me. People filter it out
Yes.
and they think, oh, they don't want bad news. I've got no problem with bad news. I want to know bad news. If something's not working, I want to know about it.
Mm.
So again, we encourage a culture here where it's fine. If something's gone wrong, it does. Let us know.
That's
Someone's
remarkably mature, actually, as an organization and kind of freeing so that people don't have to be, getting sick from worry as well about this thing that they're trying to hide that is eventually going to possibly explode if it's enough of a mistake or an issue. And it just strikes me as very realistic because things are going to happen.
Yeah. We think we live in a hermetic vacuum, where we can control every outcome and every possibility. You just can't. So live with the uncertainty. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Uncertainty's fine. Keeps it
Yeah.
interesting. It's that kind of things, but it's also how that plays out in the little things. I don't send out emails after 5:30 or the
Right.
weekends. When I started here, I've been here a month, and I was doing I was closing one of our staff summits, and I said I will never email you after any of you after 5:30 or the weekends, because even if, and I've met some leaders who do, and they always put at the bottom of it, "Oh, don't feel any pressure to reply," but people do.
Yeah.
They just do. If you get an email from the senior leader of the weekends, it's
It
going to play
feels
on your mind.
urgent.
Yeah, it does. And even if you're saying, "Oh no, don't worry about, don't reply till Monday," it's still sitting in your mind.
Yeah.
I've been there. I remember it. So I think it's how we make public these things. That if we want to give people space and create space, then do the little things as well. Because otherwise, it's the little things that undermine what you're trying to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And you kind of led nicely to my next question, which is about evaluation and the nervous system. And we were talking a little bit about trauma earlier on. I'm very interested in trauma, and one of the major kind of theorists is Stephen Porges, who says universities are kind of unsafe institutions inherently because of the amount of evaluation. And there's no way getting around it in some ways. Students have to be evaluated, staff are evaluated by students who've become consumers. They have to participate in committees, they have to teach, they have to publish. There's a lot of pressures on them. And students need to attain in order to, get on masters and PhD programs, all of this. But what can we do in universities to make them as kind of safe and healthy as possible so that students and staff alike can thrive in them?
Like most things in leadership and organisations, it comes down to the culture. It comes down to normalising that kind of evaluation and emphasising this. The point isn't about the evaluation; it's about the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy, but it's easy to say. I still remember when I got my first rejection from a peer-reviewed article.
Oh, yeah.
So I was in my second, third year of PhD, and it stung.
It's not nice.
It really stung, and I remember it so distinctly because, like everything we do in higher education, you put so much of yourself into it, so much time, so much thought, and it becomes it's just part of your identity. If you work in academia, particularly, it can overtake your identity.
Mm.
So we need to normalise this. And when I've done sessions on publishing, for example, I've always shared my rejections.
Mm.
And start with that. A reviewer two. Let's acknowledge a reviewer two hates your guts. They hate everything you've ever written. They can't stand you, and you get that negative feedback. There'll always be one reviewer like that. If there's an academic who's never had that kind of visceral feedback, I'll be amazed. So it's about showing that. I talk a lot about things I've tried that failed. I've talked about when I've been through 7 Ofsteds.
Right.
Back when I
Okay.
was in FE,
Wow.
also leading it. So normalising that, because again, I've seen how that can impact people, and there's
Yes.
no greater scrutiny than that kind of evaluation. So it's helping people through that, but helping, and again, what I was talking about earlier, normalise failure.
Mm.
If you're being observed if you're doing a teaching observation, for example, you're going to have some days where everything will go wrong. It will be a terrible session. But we're not going to say, well, that makes you a terrible teacher, or you have one bad research article and you think, well, that makes you a terrible researcher. You have to get these things in a proportion and talk people through it. The PhD, for example, is the phrase that it's the worst bit of research you'll ever do is great. I really like that. Because it doesn't feel like it at times. It feels so all-consuming that, if your paper goes badly, that's the end of your life. And I remember that feeling well. But it's the worst. You get better. What learning you take it from. Evaluation is, like you said, education, assessment. It's
There's
just
no
part of it.
avoiding it. Yeah.
No, there isn't. But we normalise talking about failure and normalise talking about the impact that it has upon you.
Yeah.
And again, at my level, I find it easier. It's easier sometimes to talk about your failures the more senior you are, because
Right.
you've attained a certain level despite failure.
Yes.
So you can talk about that kind of. But I also think it's so that the cultural bit is there, but it's also pragmatics. It comes down to workload, things like that. How can we get back to the core business? What we
Mm.
do as academics, so much of it doesn't improve student outcomes or improve research or improve supporting colleagues. There's a lot of pointless bureaucracy around in all
Yeah.
universities. So what we've done here is we're focusing on it, and we're just stopping doing things. I
Okay.
said, so we're doing a new workload model at the moment, and none of those are perfect. The perfect one doesn't exist, and I
No.
acknowledge that one at the workshops. It's against a proxy of academic work. But what we've done is said, as part of this, I've asked all the heads of school to go through and say, look, if people identify a pointless bit of admin, stop doing it. Just
Right.
stop. Come to me and I'll say, yes, absolutely stop.
Yeah.
Because if everything we do, the work should be about student outcomes, research, supporting colleagues, and recruiting more students.
Hmm.
Nothing else really matters in university.
Right.
So if we're doing the work that takes our colleagues away from that, we're going to either simplify the process or stop doing it.
Mm.
So we have to think about that. The bureaucracy takes us away from that important stuff, and then that provides a more stressed environment where that evaluation is taken more acutely.
Hmm.
So it's addressing culture and being a properly supportive culture, but also the pragmatics of how you underpin that, I guess.
Thanks, Damien. And have you noticed, over the last few years since COVID, that the relational side of life has suffered somewhat, both for staff and students in universities? And can anything be done to kind of claw some of the losses back, do you think?
It's an interesting one. I think how universities experienced COVID and lockdowns and the move to hybrid working or not hybrid working,
Mm.
we all experienced the same thing, but the cultures made the difference.
Mm.
There were cultures that saw, well, we're working hybrid. I mean, during lockdown, we still maintained that. In fact, we put more emphasis on that because we were very conscious of it. Suddenly, used to working together and seeing each other in the corridor and have a cup of tea or whatever it happened to be. Suddenly, you're removed and everyone's at home, and everything is the relation was through a digital interface.
Mm.
So I think there we put more emphasis on it. So we had these kind of catch ups.
Mm.
You just go and say, "You're not talking about work. How was your day?"
Mm.
To start off with, there was an artificiality with it. It wasn't.
Mm.
It's kind
Sure.
of, well, how are you today? How was your day? What did you? But then after a while, it becomes the new normal, and you're talking about, well, couldn't get anything in the supermarket. There's no toilet roll or no
Mm.
eggs. Do you remember back in those days? Coming back now, that's been forgotten about. I think it has. Hybrid working, I don't think I'm a supporter of hybrid work.
Right.
I don't think it should be the end of the relational aspect. When I still work, at home some of the time, and all my colleagues do. But we're still maintaining contact, whether it's through WhatsApp or just having a chat.
Mm.
Not so much emails, but we do. I will call people rather than send an email. I'll call people up.
Mm.
Even if it's 2 minutes, A, it's sometimes quicker than email,
Mm.
but B, you have to remember that relation aspect. There's a lot of bonuses to hybrid working, but the relational has to be prioritized.
Mm.
So yeah, I think we've done a lot of learning, and we seem to be going back on some of that learning. Though.
Mm.
The pandemic forced us to work in a different kind of way and think about digital relations and
Mm-hmm.
how that can operate. We've forgotten some of that learning.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, but different universities are experiencing that differently. Some do it really well. Others are just that kind of isolation. And academia, it can be an isolating experience. I was reading a study, it was around women at work. It was something like 60-70% of women experience loneliness at work.
Mm.
And that's pre-pandemic as well.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't think about a golden age before the pandemic when everyone was on campus and It
No,
was
you're
all,
so right. Yeah. And then when you add in again the other stresses that women in the workplace might have felt, if they were um, a lesbian or a black woman, and from a poorer background originally with a stronger accent, how embraced and how easy were the relational dynamics pre-COVID anyway, in that area. There's actually a very interesting woman from Ireland, Katrina O'Sullivan, who wrote a book, Poor. I don't know if you've heard of it. She lived in the UK for a while, but she's really interesting and quite provocative as well to educators and in primary, secondary school, but also universities, just to be mindful and to realize that sometimes it's very small things that can make the difference with the student or a colleague, I think, as well. It's kind of having their back and connecting in that more heart-centered way and taking a genuine interest, like you were saying, an authentic, real, like you can't fake certain things, I think, and people feel it in their gut if you do believe in them and it does kind of matter. Even if you don't always see the outcomes. And for her, there were two teachers in primary and secondary who made a huge influence on her that they never knew of, really. And I'm sure you've had that impact too, that you don't ever know the end story for someone. And I've completely digressed there, but I just think it is about the relational and the kind of the heart as much sometimes as the mind in these matters. I've just one other question for you, Damien, and I kind of ask this one to everyone. It's not so much related to education per se, although it kind of is too, because it's just about flourishing in general. Um, and, being able to learn is a huge part of that. But what do you think politicians and policymakers can do to promote kind of safe, healthy, relationships in childhood and equitable conditions so that all children can thrive and then have a good, meaningful, productive, connected life over time?
focus on poverty.
Right.
I'll always keep coming back to that, and people say, "Oh, you never eliminate poverty."
Mm.
You can have the political debates, but we've got the highest rates of childhood poverty in 80 years. Life expectancy amongst people from poorer backgrounds is decreasing. It's getting worse. There's also a lack. There's too much atomization, I think, in the of our systems. Interprofessional working has got. We've talked about this for years. I remember when I first went to university, people talk about interprofessional work. Still doesn't happen very well. Do you know one of the sectors that I keep coming back to that I think does this really well was alternative provision. So I did some research on it a few years ago. So what used to be called the pupil referral units,
Okay.
that kind of provision, outside of the mainstream school. The way they work, those practitioners there, and it's a hard job. I mean, you talk about the stress of the job and the kind of inherited trauma of doing that job. What they do really well is they link up, they work closely with families, they go out into the home, they work with social workers, the police, with all of the professional services, health services, and they're completely underfunded. But where it works so well. They're re-engaging these children whose lives would be decimated if it wasn't for them. And the way they work effectively to bridge the gaps between, I've talked about expanding putty. They're filling the gaps between all these professional services that families interact with. That's the kind of glowing example. If that was properly funded. Do you remember like Sure Start centres?
Yeah.
The Sure Start centres were fantastic. I'm not saying they were perfect, but they were there. There was a place where you could bring all the professionals needed to support children from a young age right the way through. Now, if there was that kind of approach on a systemic level that brought in primary, secondary, FE colleges, universities, and then employers as well, that would be a hell of a thing. So a systemic Sure Start centre focused on longitudinal outcomes for children, that would be a hell of a thing.
Okay, Professor Damien Page, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I've loved chatting to you, and you sound like an amazing guy to work with and for at the university there. They're very lucky to have you, the students and the staff. Thank you, Damien.
Thanks, Jane. It's been an absolute pleasure.